moving into chapter 33 this week, but I want to take a brief look back at chapter 32 because it kind of leads into 33. If you remember, chapter 32 begins with a prophetic message regarding the king who would reign in righteousness and rulers who would rule with justice. And I believe it's talking about that time when the Messianic kingdom is established, and that it's pointing to this future king who would be Israel's Messiah. But the last half of chapter 32 contains an oracle to the women of Jerusalem. And in that oracle, and like I said last week, I think the reason this is directed to the women of Jerusalem is because the men simply aren't getting what God is trying to say to them regarding these alliances with Assyria originally and then with Egypt that they're trying to put together. And he starts off talking about the complacency of the women in Jerusalem because they're not concerning themselves with what you might call the affairs of state. The reason being is that their concerns were with the household, the family. And the men were the ones responsible for conducting the affairs of state. And of course, they weren't listening to God. And I think God is then going to the women saying, okay, the men aren't listening. I'm going to tell you, and maybe you'll get their attention. And essentially what was said to the women of Jerusalem was that in about a year's time, the grape harvest would fail, the fruit harvest would fail. And you get the impression that the fields, the crops in the fields would be destroyed and lost. And this disaster was coming. And of course, the coming disaster was the army of Assyria that would be marching on Jerusalem because King Hezekiah had rebelled against Sennacherib and had stopped making his tributary payment to keep Sennacherib and the Assyrian king happy. Chapter 33 begins verse 1, "Woe to you, destroyer, you who have not been destroyed. Woe to you, betrayer, you who have not been betrayed. When you stop destroying, you will be destroyed. When you stop betraying, you will be betrayed." And it's a little ambiguous who this is being directed towards. But if you look at the context of this entire chapter, you begin to realize that the destroyer and the betrayer spoken of here in verse 1 appears to be Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. Sennacherib became king of Assyria when his father, Sargon II, was defeated and killed in battle. This was seen by several of the satellite kingdoms, the tributary kingdoms to Assyria, as a sign of weakening of the Assyrian Empire. And so they started rebelling, thinking that they could finally break free of the Assyrian yoke. And of course, Judah was among those kingdoms that rebelled, Hezekiah doing so by refusing to send his tributary payment. And of course, this eventually led Sennacherib, as he started going in and proving that Assyria hadn't really been weakened at all, Sennacherib bringing these other kingdoms back into the fold, eventually marching on Judah and Jerusalem. And of course, Sennacherib comes down. Hezekiah sees the army marching against Jerusalem, and he says to himself, perhaps I made a mistake. And he ends up taking the silver out of the temple, stripping the gold off the doors of the temple, and taking the silver and gold out of the palace and making this tributary payment to Sennacherib, which Sennacherib receives, assuming with the assurance that he would leave Jerusalem, Judah and Jerusalem alone. And he then marches on Egypt and takes care of Egypt, but then comes back and relays siege to Jerusalem. And the destroyer is talking about how Sennacherib has had such success in his military campaigns. The destroyer who has not been destroyed. And the betrayer talks about Sennacherib turning on Jerusalem and Hezekiah and relaying siege to the city after having we believe, promised that he would not do so. Sennacherib's army is eventually destroyed. So when you stop destroying, you will be destroyed. I think is talking about that night when the angel of the Lord comes and slays 185,000 Assyrian troops. And then the betrayer will eventually be betrayed. Sennacherib eventually was assassinated by one or more of his sons. It seemed under mysterious circumstances. I think I had read somewhere that he might have been in one of his temples worshiping when he was struck down by one or more of his sons. So he eventually was betrayed. So that's what that means. Woe to you, destroyer, you who have not been destroyed. Woe to you, betrayer, you who have not been betrayed. When you stop destroying, you will be destroyed. When you stop betraying, you will be betrayed. And then as we move into verse 2, we see Isaiah begin to offer this prayer. Isaiah says, Lord, be gracious to us. We long for you. Be our strength every morning. Be our salvation in time of distress. At the uproar of your army, the peoples flee. When you rise up, the nations scatter. Your plunder, O nations, is harvested as by young locusts. Like a swarm of locusts, people pounce on it. The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He will fill Zion with his justice and righteousness. He will be a sure foundation for your times, a rich store of salvation and wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the key to this treasure. Again, I think we see talking about the present situation, but then this particular passage kind of moving again towards that future messianic kingdom. But Isaiah here seems to be expressing his hope and the hopes of the righteous remnant in Jerusalem. Like I said, there were basically three factions in Jerusalem at this time. One wanted to maintain the status quo with Assyria. One wanted to see an alliance with Egypt to throw off the yoke of Assyria. I guess they wanted to replace the yoke of Assyria with the yoke of Egypt. And the smaller faction, which was the remnant, the righteous, who wanted to rely on the Lord. And I think I said in an earlier study, this was the smallest group, and it was the one group that neither of the other groups were listening to. Verse 3 says, at the uproar of your army, the Lord's army, the peoples flee, talking about the armies coming against Jerusalem. When you rise up, the nations will scatter. And that's what we see. The prophet here is declaring that when the Lord raises up against Jerusalem's enemies, against the children of Israel's enemies, they will scatter, they will flee. And then he goes on, verse 4, and talks about the plunder being harvested as by young locusts. Basically giving us this picture of what's remaining of Sennacherib's army as they flee after this night when 185,000 men are slain. They're basically leaving all the plunder that they've looted behind or dropping as they're going, so that the people that are in Jerusalem go out like locusts plunging onto a crop, devouring it. They're going to devour this plunder of the Assyrians. Then in verse 5 and 6, Isaiah writes, the Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He will fill Zion, which of course is Jerusalem. He will fill Zion with his justice and righteousness. He will be the sure foundation for your times, a rich store of salvation and wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the key to this treasure. And this is showing us the time after the Lord delivers his people. And like I said, I think is also beginning to point to that eventual time when Messiah will establish his kingdom on the Davidic throne, and the kingdom of Israel is reestablished as the Messiah's kingdom. Then verse 7, look, their brave men cry aloud in the streets. The envoys of peace weep bitterly. The highways are deserted. No travelers are on the roads. The treaty is broken. Its witnesses are despised. No one is respected. The land dries up and wastes away. Lebanon is ashamed and withers. Sharon is like the Arabah, and Bashan and Carmel drop their leaves. So with this prayer concluded, Isaiah looks back to this near future. I believe the brave men who were crying in the streets, the envoys of peace who weep bitterly, are most likely those in Jerusalem who either wanted to see the status quo maintained, but probably mostly those that were looking for this alliance with Egypt to be the way that Israel would be, or Jerusalem and Judah would be delivered from the hand of the Assyrians. There's some debate among historical scholars as to whether or not there were one or two sieges of Jerusalem by Sennacherib. Some say there was only one, some say there were two. I tend to believe there were actually two, simply because of the way the verses here in chapter 33 kind of describe the situation. And I believe what happened is Sennacherib comes down and kind of lays the siege to Jerusalem to get Hezekiah's attention. And it's at this time when Hezekiah pays the tribute payment, and Sennacherib then goes down to Egypt to take care of the Egyptians that have been started marching north. I think at some point in this campaign, Sennacherib becomes aware that that Judah has been trying to make this treaty with Egypt against him. And that's probably why he then comes back and relays siege to Jerusalem. I believe this is the reference to the treaty that's broken. He'd made a treaty with Hezekiah. And it's looking at Hezekiah having broken the treaty because he's gone to the Egyptians, or Sennacherib having broken the treaty because he's come back and laid siege to Jerusalem when he said he wouldn't. And given this would seem to be an indication of a second siege. Verse 9 describes what the army of Assyria has done in this march from their capital down through Lebanon, what once was the northern kingdom, into Judah. Verse 9 says, "The land dries up and wastes away. Lebanon is ashamed and withers. Sharon is like the Arabah, and Bashan and Carmel drop their leaves." The great forest of Lebanon, we talk about the cedars of Lebanon, these trees that were sent to Solomon when he built the temple, part of the temple and part of his palace. These are decimated by the Assyrians. Sharon, it was a great fertile plain along the Mediterranean shore. The land dries up and wastes away. Sharon is like the Arabah, the great fertile plain that ran from basically around the area of Carmel down to Joppa. It describes has become like the Arabah, which is that desert area that runs south of the Dead Sea into the Gulf of Aqaba. This fertile plain has become a desert, basically. Bashan and Carmel were the two great the high fertile plains on either side of the Sea of Galilee. And it says that they have dropped their leaves. In other words, they have become barren lands. So basically what it's describing is the Assyrian army coming down and plundering, and what they can't take in plunder from these fields, from these crops, vineyards and so forth, they're destroying, which is what is described back in chapter 32. This scorched earth coming down. And then in verse 10, we see the Lord himself begin to speak directly through the prophet. "Now will I arise, says the Lord. Now will I be exalted. Now will I be lifted up. You conceive chaff, you give birth to straw. Your breath is a fire that consumes you. The peoples will be burned to ashes. Like cut thorn bushes, they will be set ablaze. You who are far away, hear what I have done. You who are near, acknowledge my power." Verse 10, "Now will I arise. Now will I be exalted. Now will I be lifted up." The Lord is telling the people of Judah and Jerusalem that he is about to act. Verse 11 says, "You conceive chaff, you give birth to straw. Your breath is a fire that consumes you." This seems to be the Lord basically condemning those in Jerusalem and in Judah who have sought deliverance through their own wisdom, through their own efforts, sought deliverance from Assyria. Basically, those who would have gone down to Egypt, or those who did go down to Egypt to make this disastrous treaty. And the result of those efforts, verse 12 says, the peoples will be burned like ashes, like cut thorn bushes, they will be set ablaze. In other words, their folly in doing this will be their own destruction. And we see references to those trying to leave Jerusalem during this siege being captured, killed, sold into slavery by the army that's laying siege to Jerusalem. Then verse 13 calls for those who are near and those who are far off to take notice of what the Lord is about to do, what the Lord will have done. In verse 14, we see description of what is beginning to take place in Jerusalem. The sinners in Zion are terrified. Trembling grips the godless. Who of us can dwell with the consuming fire? Who of us can dwell with everlasting burning? And to these two rhetorical questions, we are given the answer in verses 15 and 16. So who can survive the fury of God's wrath? Verse 15, those who walk righteously and speak what is right, who reject gain from extortion and keep their hands from accepting bribes, who stop their ears against plots of murder and shut their eyes against contemplating evil. They are the ones who dwell on the heights, whose refuge will be the mountain fortress. Their bread will be supplied, and water will not fail them. As David wrote in Psalm 37, verse 25, I was young, and now I am old, yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken, or their children begging bread. Those who are in that righteous remnants, they may have to face some of the troubles coming against the godless, the ungodly, but they will be given the grace to survive whatever is coming. And I think that's basically then what verse 15 and 16 are saying. Who can survive the wrath of God? Those who are part of that godly, righteous remnant. Verse 17, your eyes will see the king in his beauty and view a land that stretches afar. And I believe this is spoken to that righteous remnant in Jerusalem. The king here, I believe, is King Hezekiah. And King Hezekiah is called in the scriptures as one of the most righteous kings that ever sit on the Davidic throne after the division of the kingdom at Solomon's death. The scriptures declare that in Judah there was no king greater than Hezekiah, either before him or after him. Hezekiah returned the kingdom of Judah to the worship of the Lord, which his father Ahaz had drifted so far into paganism and idolatry. Hezekiah cut down the Asherah poles. He broke up the pagan altars in Judah and surrounding Jerusalem. He restored and rededicated the temple, and he even went and invited the righteous remnant that had survived the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom to come down once the temple had been restored and rededicated to celebrate Passover for the first time in probably a couple of decades under Ahaz. So you have this righteous remnant from the northern kingdom coming down to Jerusalem. But with all of this righteousness, Hezekiah also was human, and like all of us, sometimes doesn't do everything God's calling us to do. He oversaw this disastrous alliance with Egypt because he listened to the ungodly counsel of some of his advisors. At least that's my belief. And as we shall see, the Lord does not intervene against Assyria until Hezekiah finally humbles himself, with his second siege of Jerusalem, and goes to the temple and calls for Isaiah and says, "What do we do?" And it's at this point when the righteous remnant in Jerusalem will behold King Hezekiah in his beauty and view a land delivered from the hand of the Assyrians. Verse 18, "In your thoughts you will ponder the former terror. Where is that chief officer? Where is the one who took the revenue? Where is the officer in charge of the towers? You will see those arrogant people no more, people whose speech is obscure, whose language is strange and incomprehensible." So the chief officer, the tax collector, the officer in charge, essentially the officer in charge of the Assyrian occupation of Judah at the time of these sieges. It says, after the Lord's deliverance, those who are in Jerusalem will ponder the fate of these Assyrians. The Lord promises in verse 19, he says, "You will see those arrogant people no more, people whose speech is obscure, whose language is strange and incomprehensible." And I think this is one of the keys to understanding that this chapter is talking about Sennacherib and the Assyrians, because back in chapter 28, verse 11, we see a similar description of the Assyrians as God is preparing to use the Assyrians as his instrument of judgment against the northern kingdom. 28:11, "Very well then, with foreign lips and strange tongues, God will speak to this people." Of course, this people in that case was the people of the northern kingdom. Similar description, which is why I think it's fairly clear that this chapter is dealing with the Assyrians and this coming siege and deliverance that we see when we get into, I believe, verse 30 or chapter 36. Then in verse 20, Isaiah seems again to be looking at the distant Messianic kingdom. He writes, "Look on Zion, the city of our festivals. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, a peaceful abode, a tent that will not be moved. Its stakes will never be pulled up, nor any of its ropes broken. There the Lord will be our mighty one. It will be like a place of broad rivers and streams. No galley with oars will ride them, no mighty ship will sail them. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. It is he who will save us." In verse 20, Jerusalem is described as a peaceful abode. It is compared to a tent that will not be moved, a tent whose stakes will never be pulled up, tied with ropes that will never be broken. Well, we know even today Jerusalem is hardly a peaceful abode. We also know that after Isaiah's time, Jerusalem was destroyed twice, reduced to rubble. Once by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, once by the Romans under the general Titus. So that permanence being talked about here is not really applied to the Jerusalem of Isaiah's time, even to the Jerusalem of our time. So it must be a Jerusalem at a future time when Messiah has established his kingdom and claimed Jerusalem as his capital and reoccupies the Davidic throne in Jerusalem. Verse 21 seems to bear this out, this future, peaceful, permanent Jerusalem. The Lord will be Jerusalem's mighty one, seemingly resident in Jerusalem. At this time, Jerusalem is described as a city surrounded by broad rivers and streams that no warship will be able to approach. Well, of course, Jerusalem doesn't really sit on any body of water. And I think what it's describing here is that the Lord will be like this broad river surrounding the city, protecting it, that no warship can approach because of the Lord's presence in the city. Verse 22 concludes this passage telling us that in this time the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. It is he who will save us. So like I said, I think this passage is looking now at that future time when Messiah will sit in Jerusalem in that time of the Lord at the end of the age. And then Isaiah concludes chapter 33 with this curious verse. This is verse 23. Your rigging hangs loose. The mast is not held secure. The sail is not spread. Then an abundance of spoils will be divided, and even the lame will carry off plunder. Now there's some debate as to whom this verse is given for, who it's aimed at. There's some who think that it might be talking about Assyria. But verse 24 seems to indicate that it's actually talking about Judah and Jerusalem. And I believe that is the case, that this is talking about Judah and Jerusalem. So after we've seen everything we've seen in chapter 33 so far, where we've seen this attack, this siege, Sennacherib surrounding Jerusalem with this vast army, and the deliverance of Jerusalem by the hand of the Lord, when the angel of the Lord goes in and slays the 185,000 Assyrian troops, that we come down now to this verse that talks about destruction of a people. Again, your rigging hangs loose, the mast is not held secure, the sail is not spread. Then an abundance of spoils will be divided, and even the lame will carry off plunder. In verse 24, no one living in Zion will say, I am ill, and the sins of those who dwell there will be forgiven. The reference to the ship not prepared to make a voyage across the sea, I think it seems to indicate that the peoples of Jerusalem are not still have not fully embraced the Lord God. Because we know at Hezekiah's death, when Manasseh becomes king, they drop back into their paganism and idolatry, and Manasseh actually becomes one of the evilest kings to ever sit on the Davidic throne in the kingdom of Judah. They have become a people so weakened that when a new enemy confronts them, in this case Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, they are unable to defend themselves against the Babylonians. The Spirit of God has left the city and will no longer protect the city, because they have reached this point where they have become so unrighteous and so ungodly and so idolatrous that the Lord has said, you've been warned enough, I'm done with you. And of course, this is the bulk of the message of Jeremiah. But 70 years of exile in Babylon is what Jeremiah prophesied and what followed. And a destruction of Jerusalem so intense, so great, that even the lame will be able to carry off plunder from what's left of the city. Verse 24 is what I believe then ties verse 23 to Judah and Jerusalem, because it says, no one living in Zion. Seems to point in that direction. No one living in Zion will say, I am ill, and the sins of those who dwell there will be forgiven. Talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. It talks about the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah under Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and then ultimately the Lord's forgiveness of those who ultimately return to him, that righteous remnant who comes back to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. Any questions? So, into chapter 34 next week. Thank you.